Elaine here. Last episode, Carlin and I talked about the 4B movement and how it is shaping how women view relationships and their place in society, both in South Korea, where it started, and in our experiences more broadly. The conversation focused on the experiences of women, but I wanted to discuss how men are facing a similar, perhaps more devastating choice when it comes to women and relationships. Today, we are focusing on the Manosphere, a space where young men are at risk of radicalization by an anti-feminist movement. As it becomes more mainstream with voices like Joe Rogan, Mark Zuckerberg, etc. joining the cause, I wanted to take a moment to consider the ramifications. Also, since we are both women and therefore distinctly removed from joining this space, we thought we would also ask our brother Strand for his perspective on this recent phenomenon. We'll bring him in at the end to ask for his additional thoughts on our conversation.
Hi, I'm Carlin.
And I'm Elaine.
We are sisters.
And this is our podcast, Related. Okay, Carlin. So I've been talking about the Manosphere
Okay,
for a
Elaine.
while.
Yes, you have.
And my overarching question is someone at fault here? Are we failing men or are men failing us? But before we dive into that great existential question, can I just ask, when did you first perceive the Manosphere? What is your perception of the Manosphere?
My entry point was frankly through Silicon Valley. And I think it felt more recent and closer. For those who don't know, I work in tech for the most part, in consumer tech. I know a lot of people who work at the Metas, the Googles, the Reddits of the world. And so this recent sort of post-Trump election with Mark Andreessen, who's a popular venture capitalist, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, all sort of feeding into this idea of masculinity, and even some being as explicit to say that there's not enough masculinity in tech companies right now, has shed light for me on the that was my entry point to the conversation, which is, and then again, then going back and reading all this literature and podcasts that you sent me, I was like, oh gosh, this goes so much deeper. And again, it didn't come off as a surprise per se. I just don't think I had spent as much time trying to understand, frankly, the subcultures and the community that exists, especially online, around it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, you answered how you became aware of it. And what's your perception of it?
Young white men, frankly, who, and I was thinking about this, and this maybe sort of gets to your other question around, are we feeling men? Are we not? I think my general sentiment, and again, this is maybe going to come off a little bit judgy, is it's young white men who feel lost, who feel maybe abandoned by society, who feel that the roles that they were raised up to be, think breadwinner, homeowner, husband, are increasingly difficult to achieve and are feeling insecure and unsupported and at odds with what they're raised to want or be versus the reality.
So I pose this as a juxtaposition to our 4B conversation. And what you just said, I think really resonates with the conversation we had last time about women not really feeling that society is responding to what they really want or what they've been told to want. And there's this disconnect. And I think as things become less attainable, like homeowning or having kids and feeling financially secure become less attainable, it's easier to siphon these men off, and women to that lesser degree that we talked about, but men off, especially if they've had this breadwinner mentality. And then I think also a part of that is that they're framing women as the enemy instead of the social network.
Yeah. So this was really interesting to me, and I feel like psychologically it kind of makes sense to me.
Oh,
Like,
it totally makes sense to me.
If you're a lonely, isolated, insecure young man, right? To like, people build community often around a common enemy. And if women are, you know, getting good jobs, are increasingly becoming breadwinners, are increasingly maybe saying no to marriage or traditional realms, like, of course you would make them the common enemy and build community around that. So okay, it's weird to say I understand it because I don't believe in it, but I understand the psychology behind it. Yeah.
Oh, I totally understand it. Yeah. I think humans are designed to reach out and find commonalities and build community based on that. So just what you said. And I think when the world is hard and you see other people succeeding to a level that they previously haven't, you're wondering like, why am I not achieving that level, or why am I not achieving the levels that people that look like me in the past have achieved? Like, what's wrong with me? And there's this comfort in there being other people who are feeling the same thing. Yeah. I also think that, and you see this now with like Trump and DEI, is that there have been figures that have been pointing to this boogeyman, and you're looking for someone to blame, and you see someone talking about DEI. Then it's easy to like latch onto that and start thinking.
If you're a man in your late 20s or 30s and are dating and you're not finding the so-called woman of your dreams or the one, then I can understand why similarly in parallel you would treat women as the enemy. What the conversation brings up for me, and I would say that generally the men in my friend group, and I use that word pretty expansively. I'm not necessarily close friends with some of these men anymore, but people I know from college or from my 20s or whatnot. I was thinking a lot about this because a lot of my male friends have really struggled, whether it's
like more like, sorry, I'm going to let you continue, but like more so than your female colleagues and peers.
Okay, I think the question that I, for whatever reason, keep coming back to, or this specific concept and topic brings back to me is like, are men all right? And I think that I spend as a woman a lot of time thinking about, are women all right? And frankly, a lot of the time I'm like, no, we're not all right, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of visibility, at least right now among my communities, around the reasons why that is. But then thinking about men, and I think about my male friends, and there are these sort of undertones, frankly, of addiction to drugs, sex, pornography, to like some pretty significant mental health. I've had a couple of male friends die by suicide. I've had a couple male friends develop schizophrenia in their late 20s. And that stuff I'm seeing more with my male friends than with my female friends. And so it does pose the question for me. And again, these men I'm talking about in sort of my larger community maybe aren't necessarily the people who would be in the red pill community on Reddit per se, but they're not okay. And so I don't know why that question came up for me in context of the Manosphere of red pill, of just this broader question of how is or isn't society supporting men? You know,
No, I totally agree. I actually think that, and we talked about this last time, is that there's been, as women are getting more independent, I think there's been a lot of pressure on men to meet women more halfway. But I spoke about this, and I don't think that they've been raised that way. So there's a disconnect. But at the same time, we are not providing a foundation for them to build to the halfway point.
Yeah.
And we talk about the mental load. Women have been, in addition to being programmed for the mental load, I think have been trained for the mental load.
Yep. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think
and we also have trained for it and also given permission to be more emotional about it, to bond with other women about it, to have more of the mechanisms to build community around it, perhaps in a mentally and emotionally more sustainable and healthy way.
Yeah. In times when boys and men fail, we often go to the boys will be boys.
Yep.
Like, this is just the way it is, instead of addressing that, fixing it, giving them the foundation to actually grow beyond that. And I can see how not having that support would be incredibly isolating.
Yep. Yeah. I was feeling a tension as you were saying that, because on the one hand, when we say we, right, as we're not providing a bridge, I think of it as you, me, Elaine, women, and the other women in our lives. So right. Okay, that's even more emotional mental load for women to carry that for men, right?
Right.
So I think about that. And then I also think about, the role models we have in government right now, for example, i.e. Trump, who are super machismo and super anti-women. So it's on the one hand, okay, how do we reach across the aisle? And then on the other hand, there's this other modeling that's happening that's just so in contradiction with that.
Yeah. And I think if I had been aware of this phenomenon pre-Trump, I would have kind of dismissed it. I would have said men are isolated, and that's just growing pains of the social evolution of where we're at. It sucks, and we should as a society, not women, but as a society, we should support them. But I think I would have been a little dismissive of it.
Yeah. I think also, too, my perspective would have been well, women have been dealing with shit for hundreds of years. So come on, buck up, dudes. But the reality is it is a pretty significant seismic shift that has occurred for men, too.
Yeah. And what you said, women have been dealing with it for a while, but we have also, I think, formed communities around that. So it's when I'm having a hard time, I know who to reach out to already. I'm not looking on the internet for that community. I've got that.
And I think what's really interesting, and I know we talked about this a little bit in the context of 4B, right? Which is the conclusion that you and I both came to was maybe it's a little too extreme and a little too anti-men. And so I think what's really interesting is looking at the Manosphere and the Red Pill as a counterpart is, you and I might feel isolated as women, or feel, there's definitely things that we're struggling with, but we go to, let's say, other women in community, but the goal isn't fuck men, right? So it's really interesting to look at the Manosphere and the Red Pill, where that is essentially the takeaway from it is women are the problem.
Yeah. So before we get into what I think is our final assessment of that question, we've talked a lot about various parties. We've talked about the general move. Do you think that there is someone at fault?
So that question is hard of who's to blame per se. I think there's so many different factors. But I think what I do keep coming back to is the very simple statement of we are not supporting our people. And I think that applies to, again, lots of different demographics, but in this case, young men.
Yes, I agree that we are not supporting I think that is the root of it. But I don't want to dismiss that there are bad actors that are taking advantage of this.
Yeah.
So I think we've answered it of who's at fault. Are we failing men, or are men failing us? I think. What do you think?
I think it's a little bit chicken and the egg for me. It's circular.
It's circular. Yeah.
You agree? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think society makes men feel isolated, which makes them need community, which makes them feel hateful, which makes them not question, which makes society worse.
Totally. And again, to your point, we're not talking about all men here, right? This is we're talking about like a specific contingent, so definitely don't want to generalize. But I do think what's really interesting, and what I think this conversation and then our conversation earlier on 4B has brought up for me, is everybody is kind of feeling like at odds, right? Yeah. With the direction we're going in some way, which is disgruntling for me, and kind of provokes this bigger question of, are we okay? And what are we doing as a society to be better for everyone? Yeah.
Though I do think, and to end hopefully on a hopeful note, is that because of this division, it's becoming more apparent where we're lacking, and conversations about where we're lacking is what actually helps us to evolve and change and grow. And so maybe in some way I was right that these are growing pains.
Yeah. Silver linings.
And speaking of growing and growing up and siblings, awkward transition to having Strand jump in and join this conversation.
Excited for his perspective.
So we'll do that next. So we're coming back from a break. So Carlin, we've had this discussion. We're both in an interesting position, I think, because in the Manosphere, we are like the stereotypical villain or villainess. We are single women with careers, and we are not white. So to get another perspective, we wanted to talk to our little brother, who is also not white, but might be closer to the situation, closer to the target viewing audience of the Manosphere.
We didn't feel like we could do this episode without a male perspective. It may not be the male perspective from the Manosphere directly, but we wanted a male perspective.
I think that's mostly a compliment. So I will take that.
Yes,
and
it is.
And I think I am the target, right? Like I am a 25, actually I'll say 18 to 35-year-old man who spends a lot of time on the internet. And that puts me squarely in the target of the Manosphere. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Yay.
So,
Thanks for being here, Strand.
So that actually brings me right to my general question, which is, what are your views of the Manosphere and why have you not been swayed by them?
Yeah, okay. So I'll start with the like most. So to your first question, like what are my views on the Manosphere? I'll kind of start by telling you about my experiences with the Manosphere, and then I think that maybe segues nicely into why I still can stay at arm's length with it. So I think, as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time on the internet. I've been kind of internet first since high school, right? Or like the majority of the way that I consume both like real content, right? Like the news, actual created media, but also like user-generated content, right? Like I've been using Reddit since like 2011 heavily. And in addition to that, I don't know why. It might be growing up in Virginia, having the interests that I do. I actually have exposure to a lot of the spaces that became the kind of breeding ground for the Manosphere and like red pilling, right? Like I don't own any guns, but I'm actually academically interested in guns. I'm not like a crazy UFC like fighter bro, but I watch a lot of content about like how to stay fit, how to like maintain muscle mass, like those types of things, right? I have an interest in military history. So like a lot of my like YouTube searches contain military or like war. And so I
am now, not to interject, I'm remembering some of the posters on your childhood bedroom.
Yeah, and his interest in World War II comes to the front.
and I'm adamantly anti-war, but I read a lot about war. And I think that's like an interesting dichotomy that like maybe we can diagnose separately. But like what this has meant is that from 2012, 2013, in all of these spaces, I have seen and had to actively avoid these particularly dangerous voices, right? Like in each of those categories, I can kind of like list a few people who I'm like, oh, their content was broadly applicable, but I could see the themes and the trends of like, oh, there's like a little bit of misogyny. Like, oh, there's actually a little bit of like blind acceptance of the Second Amendment, right? There's like these things in here where I'm like, oh, this is just like a little side. Like, this is just a little aside for like your main video, which is about this new gun that you bought, or like about this like cool new workout that you're doing. But you've figured out how to sneak in these things. And I think like those are the people. And now to get to the second question of like, what is my like actual relationship with that sphere? Both disgusted and curious, right? Like I think that it's kind of like those two things at the same time. There are some of them that like I watch a little bit of. I think the best example is probably Theo Vaughn. Like I don't seek him out, but like if he comes on, I won't immediately turn it off. But he's kind of come out more and more as a legit Trumper. And I think that is actually the like this interesting dance that all of these influencers play. And this was actually kind of like one of the core notes that I was thinking about as you guys were talking, and kind of like this ramp. I am in tech product, so I think of it as like top of funnel, or like in like a traditional product or a political sense. This is a tent, right? It's a big tent that Joe Rogan, the not the bodyguard too, he's the MC for, right? He's the one who like can stand out front, talk. People are like, oh, this guy seems to be asking interesting questions and like seems to have some firing neurons. Like, great. Like, I'm going to go listen to what this guy has to say. Every influencer has this journey where they realize that, oh, I can actually go from being mainstream to actually starting to like fall down this rabbit hole. And because we exist in this tent, and because there is this self-reinforcing echo chamber is like the right word, but it's also the wrong word, because it's about how these voices actually play off of each other and reinforce each other. It's not just an echo of like I say a thing and then that thing gets repeated. It's actually like how these individuals kind of like give each other credibility and kind of like become their own academic reference center of like, oh, Joe Rogan said what Jordan Peterson said what Charlie Kirk said what Andrew Tate said what Ben Shapiro said. And it's like, oh, now all of a sudden the political voice, the UFC voice, the gun voice, like they're all kind of saying the same thing. And those are the people who I'm engaging with. So that must be right?
Strand, I have a question. You mentioned the part of your, I don't know, I guess emotional engagement or emotional reaction to the Manosphere is one of curiosity. That really piqued me, because I think in the discussion Elaine and I had around 4B, we were talking about something really similar, to be honest, was this isn't necessarily a community we would necessarily directly identify or be part of, but there is a part of it that we empathize with, see parts of ourselves in, and or are just curious, maybe from more of an empathetic lens of where and how did women get to this place. And so I'm curious what curiosity means for you in that context.
It is morbid curiosity. It is the same curiosity that I have about cults. It's the way that, and I am not drawing the analogy, actually. I think there is a loose analogy, but it's actually not the statement I'm making. But it is interesting to think through what would or could have been different, such that this would have been more appealing to me. Like, how does this challenge like my beliefs or like my belief structure? Would I be able to resist this messaging if I were not in the position I'm in, right? Like not feeling comfortable about my life in XYZ way.
Yep.
I kind of want to dig in on that, because I think there are a lot of people in your position who are pulled in by that. So what do you think it is about your view of the world, who you are, whatever, that keeps you critical? I
had very important people telling me at every stage of my life that no matter what I did, I was enough. There is no definition of masculinity, however vague, that has ever been dangled in front of me as a goal. So while I do feel some societal pressure in that direction, all of the voices that I actually care about, and when I actually play those voices in my head, none of them think that is what success or meaning or masculinity needs to be. I think of Uncle Harold, I think of Papa, I think of Dad, I think of Grandpa, right? There's so many, whether they told me this directly or other people told me this about how they behaved. There were just so many good role models that didn't feel the need to exist within a definition of masculinity, and were still objectively great men. And so it's just like, I've never had that issue of like, I don't know what that direction needs to be.
Wait, can I ask a quick question, Elaine?
Yeah.
More just because so many of the touch points that you mentioned are men. All of them were, right? But I'm assuming that especially at least how Elaine and I understand the manosphere, a lot of it is a relationship to women too, as well.
Yeah. Shout out to your sisters.
Shout out to your sisters, to your mom, to Dory, your partner. So I'm curious also how your relationship to women and like those touch points, maybe not direct role models, but how we like perceive men or perceive masculinity have also impacted you, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has. And I think for me in a positive way, right? Because I think a lot of the women in my life, similarly, or in mom's case, with people kind of reinforcing these perspectives, like were the ones teaching me like, hey, you know, men don't need to look like this. Like, that's fine. And when you have, like, I think about like the things that my high school female friends were interested in men, those are the things that like are good, right? Like those were like, oh, he's thoughtful, right? Like, oh, he's emotionally intelligent, right? And so like I had women in my life who were grading men off of what I still believe is like the right scale, right? And like, I think if I had existed in, I'm not going to name a specific place, if I had existed somewhere else where my parents were telling me, you know, this, but then I was going to school and all of the girls were like, I don't know, like your muscles don't look big enough, or like you're not macho enough, or like, you know, what's your perspective on like, like, right? There are like so many things where like, that legitimately could have affected my value system. And I could have been like, oh, actually, like mom and dad said this, but like I'm in high school, hormones are crazy, XYZ thinks that that's cool. Like, I'm going to go check that out. And like, I did have those, right? Like, I'm not saying that like I've been on this like virtuous path my entire life, but like those are small detours as opposed to being like, you know, the narrative arc of like who I become.
I think that a lot of what pulls people into this, well, I know we're not using echo chamber, but echo chamber is dissatisfaction with their lives and the people around them. And a lot of that has to do with looks. And I know you're talking about like masculinity and your path, but I also, if I was just walking down the street and I didn't know you at all, like you you are what most people I think would consider like a masculine male from the outside. And I'm wondering,
just for listeners, our brother is like very tall. He's a good looking dude, fit.
He's smiling and blushing right now.
I'm just wondering how that affects maybe your confidence and how you approach this. Like, is it easier for you to disregard some of these messagings?
I think that's a great question. And I think this question actually starts to speak empathy to the people who don't have those things, right? And like you could fill in that blank with like 3 or 4 other dimensions where I do not fit the mold of like a typical susceptible to this messaging person, right? You know, I come from a very healthy, supportive family. Financially, I'm very secure and like very flexible. And you're right. Like I have been blessed. I think the height is the thing that I will take the most credit for. Of like, yeah, like there are some things that I've gotten genetically that a lot of people haven't, and like that's something that I do not take for granted. But you're right. I can look at my life with a level of like satisfaction and confidence that I honestly take for granted, right? Like I try not to, but like it is hard not to look through life constantly through that lens. And so I think this is where you have to have empathy for people who on any of those dimensions or many that I'm probably not even considering, don't have that to fall back on of like, oh, it's going to be all right. Like my parents will take care of me, or like, oh, it's gonna be all right. Like my family's great. Like, oh, it's gonna be all right. My hometown still cares about me, right? There's like all of these things that are missing, and people crave that. People crave that like belonging, that like that clarity of answer of like, this is right, this is good. And so, yeah, I think like that absolutely gives me another. I don't know if it's like another set of tools or just like lowers the cost of being able to resist these things.
Yeah, and I don't want to fall into our own echo chamber, but I think that calls back to what Carlin and I were talking about how men don't really have this support system in society. You mentioned a lot about family, and that's really on an individual basis versus making sure that every guy has this kind of, you know, patient.
Yeah, and like I was thinking a lot about your kind of final question of like who's at fault. I think I really kind of landed where Carlin did, which is like it's society's fault. But then I think when I was kind of interrogating that thought a little bit more, I was like, what do I really mean when I say it's society's fault? Like where in society, right? And I think it is really hard, and I'm actually thinking a lot about like MLK and Malcolm X when I say this. It is really hard as a group of oppressed people to give empathy to your oppressors. But I think that is what true grace looks like. And I think what we are seeing is a pushback from men who saw their place in the world challenged and did not have a replacement. And I think like it is incredibly sad to look women in the face and say, hey, you are responsible for providing your oppressor a replacement. But the reality is that if you want the outcome to be safe, stable, accepted, everyone needs to be bought in. And I think what we're seeing right now is a particular segment of men, some being tricked, some being led astray, whatever the cause is, not being bought into that world because they weren't told a good story about how their lives were going to be materially better because of it. And I think that story exists. Like, I think you can go to these men and say, hey, you may not make X amount of money on crypto. You may not look like this person who has these big muscles that you've seen, but like you are going to be satisfied. Like your life is going to be full. You're going to have partnership. You're going to have meaningful relationships. And I think, you know, Carlin, when you talk about men of my age and between our ages feeling emotionally untethered, that's what it is. It's that craving. It's like that desire to feel, I don't know, you and like comfortable in that.
Yeah, which is all any human being really wants, right?
Belonging.
Is to be seen and belong.
So before we wrap up, I know you had a list of notes. So is there anything else you want to point out?
So yeah, I think
lacking.
My overall was like, I think you guys largely had it right. I think it's not as white as you think it is, and don't overstate Black, Latino, and Asian men's ability to like they are feeling the same things,
as evidenced from the last election, which
yeah, they are participating in crypto scams. They are watching UFC. Like they are doing all of these things, and those are the entryways to the tent. And I think like I again, not fully formed thought. I was really thinking like, okay, what would it take to end this? Like what is the outcome? I think one is men just realize that like there's actually no light at the end of this tunnel. Like this is just a great scam. Like you are literally being sold a bill of goods that is not going to feel like what you are being told it is going to feel like. So that's like one very sad, hopefully not the actual outcome that we get to. Because I think if we get that, we're just going to have more pissed and disengaged men. I think what I'm hoping for is that as a society, we come together and we say, hey, this is a problem. Their opinions are not invalid. Here is a conversation about what meeting them where they are while also protecting the rights of women and minorities and fill in the blank looks like. And I think like that is the great failure of progressives, is like really being unable to communicate. Call it like annoying enlightened centrist, call it like whatever it is, but it's like that idea of like, oh, I'm only going to listen to people who are strictly on my side, and I'm not going to have any grace or compassion for people who are coming from the other side, I think is where we get stuck. And I think like that is my hope for this presidency, is that as progressives, we get off our high horse and we stop saying, oh, if you don't believe 100% what I think, you are not only a bad person, but you're a bad person that I'm not going to engage with. And yeah, like that's my hope, is that we all kind of admit a little fault and we say, yeah, we didn't give you enough grace. Like we didn't understand how hard this was going to be. And we're here now. And like we see you.
Yeah. Well said,
Absolutely.
Strand.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, Strand.
Thank you, Strand.
Absolutely.
You are an amazing. This was an amazing first guest on our little infant pod. You will definitely be invited back, and we hope you say yes.
What's the like compensation for this media appearance? Like, do I get like a production credit? Do I get first billing? Does my agent need to call your person?
Maybe
yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like
No, that's right. Have your people call our people.
Okay, Diego will be on the phone shortly.
I was just gonna suggest that Elaine would maybe like bake you some cookies and send them to you in the mail or something.
I could do that.
Deal. I'm a master negotiator. Let's go.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our conversation this week, we look forward to sharing more with you.
Follow us now so that when our next episode premieres in 2 weeks, you can be sure not to miss it. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
See you next time, everyone.